Hello, and welcome to another episode of the AgNext Podcast, where we're always excited to tell you about what's next from AgNext. I'm Jen Reeskamp, and I'm one of the hosts here at the AgNext Podcast, along with
Pedro Carvalho.
Awesome. And we're coming to you from Colorado State University, and we're excited to welcome Dr. John Ritten, who is one of AgNext agricultural economists, and we're going to talk about a recent publication that just came out in the Journal of Rangeland Ecology and Management. The title is, Does Drought Intensify the Effects of Black-tailed Prairie Dogs on Livestock Production and Net Revenue in the Semiarid Rangelands? Let's get into it.
So, John, welcome again. It's really nice to have you here again with us. So I will start with the first question. And the research that we will be covering today was conducted at the USDA ARS station in Nunn, Colorado. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yes. So I just want to start asking you, how did you get this relationship built? I think this come from your previous job and you started that relationship. And over the years, we're continues to do research. Can you just expand tell a little bit about the site location and how much this opportunity to work with USDA is beneficial to AgNext?
Yeah, it's great. The Central Plains Experimental Range is outside of Nunn, Colorado, in northeast Colorado, about a little over 15,000 total acres. So it's a great benefit to us to have access to some of that research because it's a much bigger research facility than we have access to. And they have just a great team of scientists out there. I've been working with them for probably a little over 10 years now. It started with a collaborative adaptive rangeland management project, now in its 10th year, going into its third iteration. That really is stakeholder-driven research looking at adaptive rotational grazing compared to kind of status quo, continuous season-long grazing of yearling steers in the Central Plains area. And so working with that team, it provides a lot of, again, access to different research capabilities than what we currently have here at CSU and at most land grants, just because of the size of that location, but also just a great way to explore research questions with a broader set of scientific minds, right? Different expertise and a really good interdisciplinary team that focuses on really applicable research questions that are really stakeholder driven, right? They come up with questions and we can provide that scientific expertise and really do kind of these longer term studies that result hopefully in usable science.
That's pretty cool. And on that partnership with stakeholders and everything, I think there's even a good involvement of producers on this type of research, right? That you usually conduct at the ARS, right? The animals are owned by a co-op here in Colorado, right? Or in Wyoming. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So the Crow Valley Livestock Association provides the animals out there for grazing. So it really is tied to producers. Again, their board helps kind of determine animals that come. So we get a nice variety, both uniformity, but also enough variety in animals that we can do scientific research. But then even on like the CARM research project, there's 11 stakeholders that really drive the research, and the scientists are in the back of the room to answer questions. And of those, 4 of them are producers that own livestock in the trials. We also have agency personnel and nonprofits as part of that stakeholder process. So really kind of that team building and kind of the stakeholder driven process, the transdisciplinary kind of aspiration that we have at land grant and AgNext specifically, right? To help make sure we're doing relevant research that's scalable, right?
It's important to have those partnerships, yeah.
Absolutely. And on this research specific, how you, the other co-authors and the stakeholders got together to answer these questions about black-tailed prairie dogs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it goes back even before this specific research project. And so some of the ARS crew that's stationed at CEPR and I had worked previously on black-tailed prairie dogs in the Thunder Basin ecoregion in northeastern Wyoming. It's a big national grassland, and so there's a bunch of private-public land that's interspersed, and some management implications arise from that.
Sure.
And so we've done some work up there previously. There are prairie dogs at the CEPR station here in Colorado, and Justin and David Augustine done some work previously looking at livestock impacts from prairie dog colonization in some of those pastures. And on most of they have enough area and enough different treatments at that center that they've been controlled in some of the experiments just to basically make the research easier to understand, right, and limit some of the randomness. But on places where they have had the prairie dogs uncontrolled, they've decided to really answer this question and tease out not just what impacts do prairie dogs have on forage productivity, right, and forage species, but can we directly measure and understand the impact that prairie dog occupation in specific pastures has on the ultimate performance of livestock, rather than have to go through that modeling exercise of translating prairie dogs into impacts on forage and then impacts to livestock. And so since they had that opportunity, it seemed like a great sense. Specifically in the last couple of years, we've had a couple of droughts. That was a natural experiment to see what are those interactions between prairie dogs and droughts directly on livestock performance.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting point in the paper. I'd never really even considered that before. So I'm curious, though, I feel like people are familiar with prairie dogs, or maybe they've seen them. Can you talk to us about kind of what their role is and why are they important to consider in the livestock production conversation?
Yeah, so prairie dogs, they're really a keystone species in a lot of this area, and their native range they used to range from Canada to Mexico. Now they're really in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and South Dakota, so probably 1% to 2% of their historical range. And so that's why there's a lot of emphasis on prairie dogs specifically, because they're just not where they used to be, so there's some concerns there. Sure. But primarily as the keystone species, right, they provide habitat for other species. Obviously, they have their tunnel system, but also they impact forage composition, bare ground. They increase forb at the expense of some grasses. But they're also prey, right? And so we care about prairie dogs because other animals eat them, including a bunch of birds, but also the black-footed ferret, which is an endangered species.
Yep. So they play an integral role in that, the habitat support, wildlife. Yeah, makes sense.
Whole ecosystem, right?
Yep.
The whole ecosystem.
And the question is how they compete with cattle, right?
Yeah. In the paper you were talking, the drought pieces and how that impacts availability. But yeah, we'd love to hear about what's the competition, not in a bad way, but what is the competition per se between the two?
Yeah, so there's a couple aspects to this. Current estimates probably 85, maybe 90% dietary overlap between livestock and prairie dogs, right? So there's direct competition for forage. But there's also the secondary effect of they can decrease quantity, but at certain times of the year, at least increase forage quality because they introduce more forbs often on colonies. And as you have actively growing vegetation, it's more quality forage. And so there's a quality quantity debate, which is often we approach that through modeling those effects. And that's where for yearlings, oftentimes the impacts aren't maybe as great as one would expect because we have more crude protein out there during the grazing season when those yearlings are utilizing those rangeland resources. Whereas for cow-calf producers, it can be a challenge because we need to get through that dormant season as well. And if there's just less forage out there, we either need to have increased hay supplies or we need to decrease our herd size to match forage supply.
So volume matters more in the cow-calf system, I would say. That's interesting. And one of the things I think I also mentioned in the paper, and it's exactly what you're mentioning here. Historically, there's no big impact on animal performance per se, right? But it's more like on the area performance because then you have to adjust stocking density. Is that correct, or how does that play? Like the animal individual performance versus the whole unit or farm performance, or
a lot of moving parts.
Yes.
Yeah. So the good economic answer is it depends.
Of course it is.
It
always
depends.
With the economists. It depends.
And so like some of the previous work that Justin and David, who are co-authors on this paper, have done has shown that until you reach a certain density or occupation of a pasture by size, minimal impacts to yearling performance, right? And once you get above 20 to 30%, it's maybe 4% to 8% decrease in individual animal performance. Once you get beyond that 30%, it becomes more dramatic. But again, it depends really on what that interaction looks like. So some of the previous work we've done in the Thunder Basin, again, we don't have good long-term studies that directly impact specifically cow operations with impacts to weaning weights, weaning percentages, all those reproductive measures that are important to a cow-calf operation. So we model a couple different options. One is just direct competition for forage. So all the prairie dogs do is eliminate some forage from that landscape. And the impacts can be minimal, again, up until a certain point, maybe 1% to 4%, unless there's a big herd or a big prairie dog expansion that coincides with a large-scale drought. Then it can be pretty devastating.
Oh, sure.
But if there's some animal behavior issues, say prairie dogs actually alter the landscape and cows won't go onto a colony. So basically
Okay.
that land is excluded. Those impacts can be pretty devastating for a cow-calf operation. And so we just don't have enough really good long-term data to model that. And part of that is we also don't know, right? Because prairie dogs have boom and bust cycles, right?
Okay.
And now we have non-native sylvatic plague. And so we have up to 98, 99% colony die-offs every 5 to 15 years, but we still haven't been able to tease out what's actually causing those. And so,
Oh, wow.
again, there's a lot of really good data out there, but we don't have good large-scale scientific studies that are replicated that we can actually tease out those specific examples of the direct impacts to livestock. So we do a lot of modeling to maybe put some sideboards on it.
And was this done on yearling steers, or was it a variety of animals?
The paper that we're talking about today was yearling steers
Okay.
owned by Crow Valley out at the Seeper Station.
Oh,
So
okay.
we did direct animal performance measurements. So what was great, and it was coincided with a wet year, a drought, an average year, and an extreme drought. So we got that weather
cool.
variation in there as well.
That's awesome. That's great.
And you also had two, I think, like scenarios where you had, let's say, low incidence of how do you call that? Low, less than 30% incidence of prairie dog, or more than that, or how?
Yeah, so what we did is we actually took some results from existing research going on out there and took data from those and paired them because it made a lot of sense to do so. It's, again, great team at ARS out there. Let's get as much out of the federal funding as we can. And so there was some of that research center where they controlled prairie dogs. So that was our control, right? There's no prairie dogs. It's always less than about 2%. So they encroach, but they're controlled if they get more than that. And then the other areas, they actually didn't control the prairie dogs. And so
Okay.
there were 5 pastures at the prairie dogs. They had a bust cycle in 2016 or 2017. And so they were starting to come back after that. So we modeled that increase in prairie dog occupancy over time. One of the pastures did actually die off halfway through. So interesting results there. This is kind of a side note in the paper you can read if you're interested about it. But so we did have that no prairie dogs or controlled prairie dogs, and then prairie dogs that were expanding after a bust cycle.
Oh, interesting. Lots of different ways to look at the data in the paper, or just different ways to analyze it. That's cool.
And how do you estimate the non-controlled? Like how do I know if I'm a producer? How do I know if I'm 10%, 17%? It's like the area of the pasture that you can see animals and.
Yeah, so we didn't do any sort of measurement of actual number of prairie dogs. It was percent
Okay.
of the pasture that was occupied. So how big was the colony as a percent of total pasture size?
Okay, I see. And the colony was just like, that's where they kind of primarily live. Their tunnel kind of exists under that. Okay. Just not as familiar with the black-tailed prairie dog. So.
Perfect. So moving to this research specifically. So let's build a scenario here. You had a non-controlled and a controlled prairie dogs. You look at over 4 different years, right? 2022, 2021, 2020, and 2019, right?
Yep.
So 2 good years of rain and intermediate and a drought year.
Yep. Well, there's 2019 and 2021 were kind of average or slightly wet years. 2020 was a drought, and 2022 was a severe drought in that area.
Okay.
So it's kind of average, dry, average, really dry.
And the main question was trying to see if the prairie dogs would affect the net return, growth performance of the animals throughout those different scenarios, right?
Yeah, and then one other aspect of seepers, I do have a couple different ecological sites. So the other variable of interest here is soil type, or really it's forage resources, but that's driven primarily by forage type out there. And so we had high productivity soils and low productivity soils that we have both in the controlled and uncontrolled.
Oh, wow. That's the interesting thing about that facility is that they've been managing that landscape the paddocks are in different styles of management, but they've been managed the same way since 1930, which is really fascinating and allows for really cool research like this where you can layer different pieces of it. Just an interesting fact about that place.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
That's great.
So let's move into the findings. So can you tell, what did you find out about doing this cool research?
I mean, I don't think this is going to be shocking to anybody, but if you're in a drought, livestock performance suffers, right? So in both 2020 and 2022, livestock gains were depressed compared to 2019 or 2021. What was interesting is that in the wet years, the pastures with prairie dogs didn't have any different performance than the pastures without prairie dogs. So prairie dogs really didn't impact livestock performance in average or slightly above average years in terms of precipitation. When it comes to drought years, the lower productivity pastures also didn't see any impact from prairie dogs. there just wasn't any grass out there, period.
Nobody
and so
ate anything.
There wasn't really a lot
Yeah.
right on offer. It was only in those higher productivity paddocks or pastures in the dry years that we saw a negative impact or consequence of having prairie dogs at higher occupancy rates.
Okay.
So it's a three-way interaction. So let's be clear again now. So the only time that you saw an interaction is like when you had low precipitation, high quality forage, and then with the prairie dog.
Yep.
So why? Is there any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I don't know that we expected that result going in. Our hypothesis in the papers that ran the low productivity pastures, there just wasn't enough grass there anyways that we didn't see the negative impact of those prairie dogs. In the high productivity pastures, even in the dry years, we had enough spring precipitation that we got some good forage growth. And so if in the absence of prairie dogs, those forage resources lasted through the grazing season.
Oh, wow.
Whereas, once that rain shut off and that grass senesced and we lost any additional production, if those prairie dogs were there, they actually consumed that forage down. And so then we didn't get the added benefit of in wet years, if prairie dogs do consume some forage, they might get, some fresh regrowth, which is going to be higher quality forage, right? Or we might get increased in forbs in response to decreased grass production that can offset some of that quantity decrease. But in dry years, we don't see that response because there's no regrowth, right? And so it really is coming down to the quantity in those higher productivity pastures. They can carry us through a dry year, at least for a 1 year drought, but not if we lose forage to other sources.
Which happened when you had the prairie dog.
Because again, they're about 85% dietary overlap. And so they're eating the same thing that buffet just disappears quicker. And there's no replenishment.
Awesome.
Interesting. So, we were talking about the study and you were talking about how like the variation in precipitation from year to year, but in semi-arid rangelands, that's always variable, right? So you might get some rain, you might get a lot of rain, you might get no rain. And so I'm curious about, if a producer is listening to this, how can they take the information from your study and apply it to their operation or their management plan, or what should they be considering?
Yeah, I think this is inclusive of the previous work we've done from the cow-calf systems up in Thunder Basin as well, is that spatial management matters, right? And so don't have a one-size-fits-all for the entire ranch. Is really think about where you're likely to see the impacts, and then look at, that interannual variability as well. And so part of that is good weather forecasts. That's one reason I would say it's a little bit easier for yearling operations than cow-calf operations because it's easier to change your stocking rate every year, flex that up or down. Yeah. Although last time we surveyed producers in Northeast Colorado, the majority of them are contracted by December or January. So by the time we actually realize how much rain we're going to get, it's a little bit too late. But again, I can pull those animals off of rangeland earlier, put them into a feedlot, take them somewhere else versus a cow-calf operation that really wants to hold on to those genetics, right, and keep them throughout the entire dormant season. So again, challenges for both, but really think about what is the future going to hold, get as good a forecast as you can, and understand your landscape, right? Where are those high productivity pastures? Where are the low productivity pastures? And then manage them differently. And again, our study didn't actually include cost of prairie dog control. And so what would it take to actually control them? But even in the absence of that cost, right, we actually didn't see any net benefit for it except for on those high productivity soils in the dry years.
One thing that happened on the dry years, and talking about moving cattle around, and it's the net return also were different in the dry years, right? In I don't know, in the paper you mentioned that was, let's say, surprising that the 2022, the shorter grazing system was the most profitable year, right?
Yeah, that was counterintuitive, and that I think speaks to the magnitude that prices in combination with precipitation play on profitable outcomes for ranching, right? Things typically outside of our control. And so again, 2022 was the severe drought year. We actually had to cut the grazing season in about half because we ran out of food, right? And animal behavior triggers told us to just pull them off and move them somewhere else. But that was, right, we're still in the middle of this upswing in cattle prices, right, which I didn't think would have lasted this long or gone this high at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But it was one of those odd situations where livestock prices increased throughout the grazing season. And so we did add about 40 pounds or 60 pounds of live weight to those animals. But the price per pound also went up, right? And so
okay.
I would not expect that to ever happen again. I'm not going to say never.
That may not be an every year thing.
Because I said the same thing in like 2014, 2015, 2016 with Big Southern Plains drought. I remember telling my class, like, this is the golden age of ranching. You're never going to see these prices again. And, you know, a decade later, here we are. But
yeah, sure.
I would not expect that to happen again. I'll put it that way.
Or soon.
Yeah.
But it might depend.
It might depend.
I'm just kidding.
You're just adding more depends to your
Exactly.
depends.
Job security.
That's awesome.
Yes.
So did you notice any kind of specific impacts on the price of yearling steers in the study, or just kind of across the board? Or, I mean, we were just talking about that, but anything else you'd want to add?
I mean, so I think the next step for this is we go back and look at we'll simulate different price scenarios, right?
Mm-hmm.
To figure out what's more likely to happen. But this was what actually happened to those prices over that 4-year period. And again, this is really a little bit of result of pandemic issues, right? So some still backlog, but then also the widespread drought that's been prolonged, right? So the national herd hasn't rebuilt yet from the last kind of sell-off. We keep expecting, us being economists, that producers are going to respond to price signals and start to retain more heifers and rebuild the herd, and it hasn't happened yet. So this is kind of like a perfect storm of factors outside of the control. I do think it is important, though, to notice that, you know, no individual producer can impact livestock prices, but the collective community is what's really driving those price swings, right? In conjunction with weather impacts, specifically drought, but also what happens to grain markets, which is influenced by either drought or flood, right? And so as we change grain prices, we also impact not just feeder cattle prices, but calf prices as well.
That's true.
Excellent. One question that I have here, John, is like going back to the black-tailed prairie dog is if I'm a producer, right, and I'm trying to think what to do, is there any recommendation or anything like it's moving cattle pasture density? What are the best ways to have let's say
a management strategy for prairie dogs?
If there is yes, and best way to manage cattle with prairie dogs, right?
Yeah, and so I think it's probably more pertinent to the cow-calf operations out there. Some of the recommendations we came up with Thunder Basin is if you have prairie dog colonies, right, utilize those pastures in the summer when you get that regrowth, when you get that increased forage quality. If prairie dog, I wouldn't use that as your winter pasture or dormant season grazing, because you're just not going to have the quantity there. So maybe move your livestock around to match what's going to be there seasonally, you know, within and across years. And then again, if you are interested in controlling prairie dogs, again, don't control the entire ranch, because you're going to waste money, right? In some of many of the scenarios we modeled in the previous paper, which is also in REM, by controlling prairie dogs, you actually didn't have a better economic return, even though you had more cows, because the cost was about equal to the increase in revenues from having more animals on your landscape. So really be selective and judicial in where you control. But if you can just move when you use those pastures across the year, that's probably a more at least cost-effective way to quote unquote manage around prairie dogs.
That's pretty good. And like we were joking before we started recording that I never thought I would be talking about prairie dogs.
Me neither.
In animal science.
Didn't know that.
Works with cattle. But that's really interesting to me, especially if we think your recommendations here right now is like try to, on the pasture that you know you have prairie dogs and you have better growth, forage growth, make sure to maybe have cattle there when you're having that greater forage growth happening, because they're actually helping potentially change the quality of that forage, right? Yeah,
and I would always, recommend talking to a local range con, whoever it is in your area that knows your specific ecological site better. But again, in Thunder Basin, like we'd see a lot of forbs early in the spring, right? But again, those tend to dry down and disappear by late season. And so if you've got a high forb content, get out there in the spring and take advantage of it, because those desiccate and they're gone, right? And so it really is understanding what's going to be available on offer, and matching that forage demand to what that supply is across your ranch.
Awesome.
And then, John, I'm curious, you've talked a little bit about this, but I want to talk about it in the broader sustainability sense, because there's a lot of trade-offs in this conversation as we're talking. And so, how does it connect to the broader idea of sustainability and trade-offs and just your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, this is inclusive of all the pillars of sustainability, right? I mean, we got economic profitability with either cost of control or impacts to, negative impacts to livestock production, but also social implications as well. We talk about anything with wildlife habitat, right?
Yes.
And ecosystem services, we need to be inclusive of that, right? And then, of course, environmental quality as well. And so I think when we look at these, we need to understand that everyone can look at that same system and see different potential outcomes. And somehow we need to manage that landscape in a way that is, again, sustainable for the relevant stakeholders. I mean, I love it when I get new students come into my office and they want us to study sustainability. And then I burst their bubble because I say, what do you want us to sustain? How long do you want us to sustain it for? And who do you want us to sustain it for, right? And so we have to make that cognitive decision and be explicit in that. But again, I think there are a lot of win-wins here. The previous study was funded in part by Humane Society, Prairie Dog Coalition, World Wildlife Fund, Environmental Defense Fund. So we had those in the same room, those organizations in the same room with producers and the U.S. Forest Service, right? So we can get through these complex kind of issues collectively. But I also think that we need to understand how complex these systems are. Again, the livestock industry itself is complex, but the ranching industry in and of itself with all these different concerns, right? And the biggest impacts to profitability from 20 years I've been working on this is prices and weather outcomes, right? Which are two things I typically don't control, right? And so we need to figure out how to get through these systems because, again, as we lose ranches in some of these rural landscapes, we also lose the communities behind them, right? Yes. So we no longer have a softball coach for my daughter to go play softball, right? We don't have those community leaders, and we also don't have people managing that landscape, right? And so we need to have people out there to make sure that, again, this land evolved with grazing animals, and we need to make sure that we don't just abandon it and see other negative outcomes take root in some of these areas where we don't
unintended
have a lot of people.
Consequence.
Absolutely.
We talk about those a lot.
Yeah, and this systems approach is it's fascinating, and with all of the depends that we can spend 3 hours here talking about. But that's amazing to zoom out and having different people in the same table talking about cattle production. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and the same thing is we can look at. I often term livestock as other versions of ecosystem engineers, right? It's not wildlife, but we can manage it so we can at least try to get outcomes at places at times that we desire, right? Yes. And so that's an option that we need to consider as well. And then again, just the focus on making sure these operations are sustainable in the fact that they're going to be here next year because there's so many variables outside their control, but collectively they also influence prices as well as food security for our nation and the world.
That's true. Just the easy stuff, nothing big.
It's fun. It's fun.
John, is there anything else you'd want to add about the paper that we didn't have a chance to talk to you about today?
I think we probably covered it pretty well, but again, just a huge thank you to the co-authors and everyone at the USDA ARS. CPERN specifically, but LTAR as a network generally. There's 19 sites now nationwide.
Oh, wow.
Croplands, grazing lands, integrated systems. So wherever you're listening to this at, reach out. They've got someone near you doing really cool work.
Do they have a website or something that folks could go to?
USDA LTAR.
Okay,
Long-term agroecosystem research.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. Well, thanks, John. And I just want to read that title again for folks. So if you have enjoyed this episode, which we hope you did, and you would like to read the paper or get some more information, the title of that is Does Drought Intensify the Effects of Black-Tailed Prairie Dogs on Livestock Production and Net Revenue in Semiarid Rangelands? You can find that on our website. As always, thanks for joining us today for the AgNext Podcast. We're always excited to tell you about what's next from AgNext. We'd love to have you join the conversation, so if you would hop on our social media channels, we'd love to have you follow us, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Awesome, and we will catch you in the next episode. Have a good one.